Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. The threat of an immediate U.S. Iran military conflict has been averted. Iran responded to the U.S. murder of its top general, Qassem Soleimani, with missile strikes on military bases housing U.S. forces inside Iraq. But Iran avoided any fatalities by giving advance warning to the Iraqi military, which then alerted its U.S. counterparts. In his first public comments at the White House, President Trump appeared to accept military de-escalation for now, while still promoting his administration's policy of so-called maximum pressure.
Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. As we continue to evaluate options in response to Iranian aggression, the United States will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. These powerful sanctions will remain until Iran changes its behavior.
Sina Toossi is a senior research analyst at the National Iranian American Council. Welcome, Sina, to Pushback. What do you make of what has happened in the last 24 hours? Iran launching this attack, Trump speaking today at the White House, appearing to welcome for now a de-escalation when it comes to at least to military conflict.
Well, first, thanks very much for having me on. I think the last 24 hours have been obviously incredibly dangerous. It's really the closest we've gotten to a direct, all-out U.S.-Iran war since U.S.-Iran hostilities really developed after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. I think it's important to really have an eye to the context of this situation, and that context is that the Trump administration, reneged on the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. They pursued this so-called maximum pressure campaign for the past almost 2 years now, which has been marked by all-out economic war. Really attacking the Iranian economy, trying to reduce its oil exports to zero, impoverishing the Iranian population, and the option that Trump gave to Iran was basically total capitulation on all their national security interests or the collapse of the entire country. And of course, both of these were untenable, and Iran was always going to increase the costs. And we've seen that in the past, about week and a half, the situation has really escalated. This round of escalation started with these rocket attacks on a U.S. base in northern Iraq, which the U.S. attributed to an Iranian kind of allied group in Iraq. That led to the death of a U.S. contractor. And then following that, there was an attack by the U.S. on an Iraqi militia base in Iraq that killed 25 of these militiamen. Then there was this attack on the U.S. embassy in Baghdad, which resulted in damage to the embassy. And then finally, we had this unprecedented U.S. assassination of the Iranian general Qassem Soleimani, who was one of Iran's top commanders, who has led this arm of the Revolutionary Guard responsible for Iran's regional policies, played a major role in the fight against ISIS. And by all accounts, undeniably, this general was a senior statesman and a senior Iranian kind of official. And this was an unprecedented assassination. It really sets a new precedent in international relations for the U.S. to do this and do it openly and gloat about it. And Soleimani, as we've seen in the past week, was a revered figure in Iran. There's been massive funeral processions for him all across the country. And this beyond anything, this as well as many other factors necessitated and made inevitable an Iranian response. And that came yesterday in these missile strikes on the U.S. bases in Iraq. And thankfully, the Iranians decided to not target actual U.S. personnel, but they signaled that their ability to kind of strike these bases. And for the moment, we've kind of averted this risk of an immediate all-out war. But I think that risk of a war is going to continue so long as Trump continues on this maximum pressure campaign and continues to not provide any real diplomatic off-ramps with Iran.
And today he promised new sanctions on Iran. Is there anything left for the U.S. to sanction that it hasn't sanctioned already?
So the U.S. has basically at this point depleted its sanctions pressure tool with Iran. They've sanctioned everything from the Iranian central bank to the Iranian sovereign wealth fund to the supreme leader to the foreign minister to all aspects of the Iranian economy. It really is the equivalent of a medieval siege. Iranian oil exports, which are the lifeblood of the economy, have been sanctioned. the Iranian population, even staple goods are increasingly unaffordable. There's been skyrocketing inflation. The value of the currency has decreased, and above all, the Iranian people have paid the price for these sanctions. And the ruling elite, meanwhile, they're still in charge. The regime is entrenched, and none of Iran's policies in the region have changed. And arguably, maximum pressure has made the region far more unstable. Has obviously threatened the risk of all-out war. And it's a policy that on every front, it's been a failure, whether the goal has been to foster Iran's capitulation or push back Iranian influence or diplomacy, which it has not been a tenable strategy to get U.S.-Iran diplomacy.
Well, let's talk about changing Iran's behavior in the Middle East. It's something that President Trump repeated today in his press conference. It's also something we hear pretty much across the political spectrum from Democrats as well. Let me play a clip of Trump talking about this today and get you to respond.
Peace and stability cannot prevail in the Middle East as long as Iran continues to foment violence, unrest, hatred, and war. The civilized world must send a clear and unified message to the Iranian regime. Your campaign of terror, murder, mayhem will not be tolerated any longer. It will not be allowed to go forward.
Yeah, I think that this singular focus that the Trump administration has on Iran as being the source of all regional ills is really a fantastical, kind of ridiculous notion. Iran is one regional power amongst many regional powers. It has interests in the region. It's trying to increase its influence. But, obviously Saudi actions in the region have been arguably more destabilizing than Iran. The war in Yemen has been the biggest humanitarian catastrophe in the world, and their spread of this kind of Wahhabi Salafist ideology that has been the wellspring of, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and al-Nusra in Syria and these other groups. And obviously the U.S. has a very ugly history of intervention in this region. So blaming Iran for everything is very simplistic and inaccurate. And I think when it comes to U.S.-Iran relations that, the JCPOA and the nuclear deal that Trump reneged on, this set a new kind of standard for U.S.-Iran diplomacy. And it was the first time that through actual diplomacy, the U.S. and Iran were able to resolve one dispute between them, and that was the nuclear deal. And this raised hopes for kind of building on those negotiations and for the U.S. and Iran through diplomacy, through compromise and negotiations, being able to address these other issues between them in the region and beyond. But Trump, by undoing that deal, he's kind of really wrecked any possibility of that. And he's taken us to this really kind of destructive status quo on Iran, where it's only pressure for the sake of pressure's sake. And it's a regime change policy, really, is what it's been. And this is it's taking us in the direction of direct conflict and war. And again, I would just emphasize that there is a potential for a different U.S.-Iran relationship. There is a potential to resolve a lot of these disputes we have in the region through diplomacy. But this policy that Trump has been electing to pursue of maximum pressure and sanctions and this very hostile rhetoric and having these maximalist demands of Iran, and Iran should have zero influence in the region, or these things that Trump just said in his speech, it's untenable. And if Trump really wants to avoid war, he needs to kind of lean off maximum pressure, offer actual sanctions relief, and rebuild the confidence that's necessary for diplomatic solutions to all these crises in the Middle East.
Can you talk to us briefly about where Iran has actually cooperated with the U.S. before, whether directly or tacitly?
Yeah, so ironically, for as much as, Soleimani is being demonized by Trump and others, and, which is not to say, he is ultimately an intelligence chief responsible for a lot of policies, many of them that have been brutal or resulted in, the deaths of people. But the U.S. and Iran's Quds Force, which is the extraterritorial wing of the Revolutionary Guards that Soleimani led, they cooperated in Afghanistan, for example, in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks, where Iran played an integral role in kind of helping defeat the Taliban and bringing to power the kind of unity Afghan government that has kind of reigned since then in Afghanistan. Similarly, in the war against Iraq, Soleimani and kind of Iran's regional allies in Iraq and Syria, they really led a lot of the ground war against ISIS in these countries and played a major role in defeating ISIS. They were one of the first kind of forces on the scene in northern Iraq, helping the Kurds to kind of push back ISIS in 2014 when ISIS was conquering large parts of Iraq. And, so, and then even, in Iraq, for example, where the major U.S. accusation is that Iran supported these proxy attacks against U.S. forces after the invasion. I think, again, this context is important, that Iran has cooperated when the U.S., when their interests were aligned, the U.S. was willing to engage with Iran diplomatically. But in Iraq, when U.S. officials accuse Iran of supporting these proxy attacks, this happened, we have to keep in mind, right after the invasion, when, according to Bush administration officials and people like John Bolton, who was in power then as well, that Iran would be next in line, and that these neoconservatives in the Bush administration, after taking out Iraq, they said real men go to Tehran. So Iran was raising the costs for America in Iraq at the time, so it wouldn't be next to face a U.S. attack.
Right. General Wesley Clark famously made public the existence of a memo under Bush saying that there was a target list of 7 countries for regime change, and Iran was one of them. I recently spoke to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who served in the Bush administration, who confirmed seeing that memo. And certainly U.S. policies from Syria to Iraq have very much followed along those lines. And this thing about the U.S., about Iran being involved in IED attacks against U.S. soldiers, well, even that has been challenged by journalists like Gareth Porter, and I'll link to an article about that for people to read about. Let me ask you finally about an explosive statement that has not gotten nearly enough attention from the Prime Minister of Iraq, Adil Abdul Mahdi, who said that Soleimani was in Iraq on a diplomatic mission. There have been reports for a while that this is happening, that Pakistan is involved in brokering talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And according to Abdul Mahdi, Trump had called him to help further these talks and had encouraged these talks. And then shortly afterwards, Soleimani was inside Iraq to deliver the Iranian response, and then he is killed by the U.S. Now, when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was asked about this at a press conference, he said that all of this was Iranian propaganda.
So, let's see. So, Zarif's statement. His first statement that is Soleimani was traveling to Baghdad on a diplomatic mission. Anybody here believe that? Is there any history that would indicate that it was remotely possible that this kind gentleman, this diplomat of great order, Qassem Soleimani, had traveled to Baghdad for the idea of conducting a peace mission? I made you reporters laugh this morning. That's fantastic. We know that wasn't true. We not only know the history, we know in that moment that was not true. Zarif is a propagandist of the first order, and most of what you suggested in his text message or email or message that you laid out there was indeed Iranian propaganda. It's not new. We've heard these same lies before. It's fundamentally false. He was not there on a diplomatic mission trying to resolve a problem.
So that's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who says all of this is Iranian propaganda, even though it came from the mouth of the Iraqi Prime Minister. Sina, Toossi, as we wrap, what do you know about this diplomatic initiative that Soleimani was reportedly pursuing?
I think that's a major part of this story that's unfortunately being underreported in the U.S. media. Like you said, according to the Iraqi Prime Minister, the Saudis, Iraq was mediating between Iran and the Saudis. The Saudis had sent a message via the Iraqis to the Iranians, and Soleimani was kind of giving Iran's response to that. And for the U.S. to take out Soleimani while he was in the midst of this seeming diplomatic mission, it's incredibly destabilizing, and it really conveys this message that the U.S. is seeking to inflame these regional tensions as opposed to doing what should be in its national interest and is in America's national interest, is to kind of help dissipate these tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia and help really bring these regional powers to peace with each other. And I think in the past couple of months, another sign of the failure of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran is that these countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, which helped spearhead these policies and the policy of maximum pressure and really helped design it with the Trump administration, that after they saw that they're going to be the countries that are going to pay the biggest cost for any war, after these attacks that were attributed to Iran and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and after they saw that Trump is he's not a reliable ally. He's not necessarily going to go to some all-out invasion of Iran and pay the cost of, attacking Iran himself. After they saw that, they've been moving towards diplomatic de-escalation with Iran. We saw the UAE last couple months ago. They reached a maritime agreement with Iran. They kind of unfroze some Iranian assets. And the Saudis have also seemingly been pursuing kind of a ceasefire in Yemen that they've been negotiating with Iran about, through Oman, actually. And there was also this Iraqi mediation channel. So I think if the U.S. really wants regional peace and stability, and really, if Trump really wants to extricate America from all these regional quagmires, the U.S. should seek peace between the regional powers and should not seek to inflame these tensions. And I think, if the Iraqi Prime Minister is to be believed, which I don't see any reason why he would lie about this. And I think, if anything, it explains how one reason the Iraqis were so furious about this, beyond the fact that the strike against Soleimani was a violation of Iraqi sovereignty, is that, the U.S. is actively undermining these peace efforts. So I think it's a very bad sign.
Sina Toossi, Senior Research Analyst at the National Iranian American Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you.